Hi everybody, welcome to beginning watercolor lesson number 2 of 15. This is the second series. I'll have a full supply list below, but here's a brief overview of what we're using today. You'll need a pencil, eraser, and the paintbrushes I'm recommending are Princeton Snap. Everything's listed below. You'll need water, a paper towel, and the paint set I'm recommending this time is the Paul Rubens set of 24. Anything will do. You don't have to go out and buy anything new. Just use whatever you have on hand. The paper that I've got here is a watercolor block. It is 100% cotton. It's Paul Rubens. And our size is 5 inches by 7 inches. So not too big. Can't get overwhelmed. We're just going to have a good time with this. So let me just scooch some things out of the way here, and then I will go ahead and get this taped up. What I'm doing is using washi tape around the border to kind of give me an edge when it's finished. And here's our reference photo. My husband and I were out walking this morning, and these echinacea or coneflower were so beautiful that I thought it would really make a great subject for us. As I'm recording this, it is the 1st of August. It's about, well, today is the 5th, and they're really at their peak right now, so they were just so pretty. Now, I don't have a line drawing for you, but I want to show you this one in real time because it really doesn't take you that much time to do. What I'm doing is I'm just kind of choosing a few of these echinacea flowers that I like their centers. So when you're planning your piece, I want you to choose an odd number of flowers and kind of spread them around on your surface there so that you have enough space filled, number one, and so that there's good flow for the eye. So you'll see when I start painting these, it might be kind of hard for you to see now. The 7 that I chose kind of cascade and peak toward they cascade down rather, and then they peak up toward the middle. Their petals fall down, which is what I really like about them, but those cones just point up to the sun. And I just thought this would be such a fun, easy, quick thing to paint to really make you feel like you could have a win before you set off for your day or after work. This one is just meant to totally give you some relaxation. So I've got my 7 little gumdrop shapes. That's kind of what they are. If you think of gumdrops or upside down strawberries. Something like that. Sometimes they've got a rounder peak. That one in the biggest one there has a pretty prominent peak to it. We're going to start with the number 6 round. And the color that we're going to use first is a burnt sienna. What we're going to do is we're going to just get our brush wet, tap it off so that it's damp, and then tip into that burnt sienna. And when we're looking at the reference photo, you can see where the cones on the coneflower, where that center part, where it's more brown, and then we're going to dip into a little bit of that cadmium red, which is kind of an orangish shade. And while that's wet, we're going to let those colors mix. This one's going to be a lot of fun for us today because we're going to do a lot of letting the watercolor play, letting the colors merge together and mix on the page. Part of the reason I want to show you this one now is because I also want you to realize what happens when you are painting and you paint up near a wet area. Watercolor wants to go wherever something is wet or damp. So if you don't want colors to mix, you want to be sure not to do this. You want to be sure and leave just a tiny bit of white space between what you're painting on. Or, for instance, if you're painting petals on a flower, paint one petal in and then go to another part on the flower to paint the next one. So now I've just kind of mixed it up a little bit. I'm putting the orange in first and then going in with the burnt sienna. Excuse me, that is cadmium red. It's not orange. And then you just kind of make that shadow part with that burnt sienna. If you don't have these colors, you could use a permanent orange and a burnt umber, anything like that. Any orange, any brown, anything like that would work just fine. And you want to kind of refer to your reference photo whenever you can so that you can kind of see where this cones in the middle are lighter and where they're darker. We're not looking for anything realistic here. We're just looking for basic changes and gradients in color. When you go into your petals now, I want to clean my palette off here because that red has some other colors mixed into it that I really don't want. When we go into our petals, what we want to make sure that we're careful of is that they touch the damp centers because we really want that watercolor effect. We really want the wash to look almost like batik fabric, if you're familiar with that, or some kind of a tie-dye. We really want these colors to merge and blend together on the page because this is all about playing with the watercolor, seeing what it does when it's wet, and having a really good time with it. Now, the color that I wrote down for this one is Anthraquinone Red. However, on the Paul Rubens set, they call it something different. Let me grab that here. They call it Madder Red. So if you have any kind of a cool red, that's the one that I've got going in that first well in the palette there. And then what I've got mixing kind of just right above it, I've got a little bit of quinacridone violet. I'm going to also go into the dioxazine violet. So you kind of want a warm purple and a cool purple, and then that cool red. We might go into the cad red, excuse me, the scarlet, which is a little bit warmer red. We might mix that one in too, but this is where you want to look on your paint palette, is in all the reds and purples. And you're just going to have fun and play. Now the brush that I'm using is a number 6 round, and you'll see when you make the petals, you just pull down and then lift up at the end, and it naturally creates that little point for you. Now it will deposit most of the paint toward the end of your stroke. However, that's kind of a cool effect, and it leaves it looking really natural and fun when we're playing with watercolor. Go ahead and overlap the petals. If you've got purple petals on one flower, come in on the next flower and go over it with some scarlet and let those petals cross, let them overlap, let that watercolor mix and mingle on your page. You're just going to have an awful lot of fun with this. Now I'm going to go back into this one down here and just kind of tap some of that dioxazine violet around the base where the cone part, the center, touches the petals. I'm just trying to create a little bit of shadow because that particular flower is going to kind of be back behind, and it's not going to be as prominent as some of the others. Whichever order you paint these in is fine. This is just a random order that I chose to do, and you'll notice for the petals that are kind of going toward the back, I'm making them a whole lot shorter. That's called foreshortening. Foreshortening is a term that you'll hear an awful lot, and we're doing a very simplified version of it here with this painting today. But what that means is you're changing the look of something so that the viewer rather can see that it has occupies a place in space, that it is either coming towards you, going behind you, to the left, to the right. We create these things, this form and dimension, by using things like this to help us with perspective. We're creating shadow, we're creating intensities of color, we're creating the dimension and shape of this flower. And the way to do that is to think of how that flower looks in its 3D natural state. So for instance, this one over here, I am painting it as if I am painting on something round. I am curving that brush around where I want those petals to curve down, and I'm keeping the petals in the back very, very short because they fall out of our vision. They are foreshortened. We cannot see them. Now let's go up to this top petal here, and you'll see when we continue to paint these petals in such a way that they have dimension and form and shape, and with all their curving and the way that we've highlighted those cones with the orange and placed, or excuse me, that cadmium red placed strategically and the burnt sienna placed on the bottom, we can then create where our light source is, and we can establish which direction these flowers are pointing toward the sun, because that cadmium red light is a natural representation of warmth and light, and that would be the direction that the flowers are pointing up and toward the sun. So you'll notice when we're all done here, all of that orange, all of that cadmium red that we put in there is a little bit off to the right and definitely the top. Now none of these flowers are facing the exact same direction, and we're able to show that with how we make our petals curve. Now, don't worry if it gets to looking like a hot mess, because I will tell you every single painting that you do will go through a very awkward phase. I call it the teenage years. This is just a time when your painting is not done yet. Don't get discouraged, because we're just about in that awkward, ugly phase right now. You need to be patient and let the paints still do what they're going to do. I'm just going over the wet red petals, and I'm adding in some purple. I'm just putting all kinds of layers in here to just let the paint play. If you've got purple on the bottom, then go over it in the scarlet. Just see what happens when the paints mix and mingle on your page. Now let's go back into this burnt sienna, and I'm going to mix it up here with putting in another layer. I'm going over the same cones, just kind of accentuating that shadow. This is something else that you'll find a lot with watercolor, is that, and I suppose with any kind of art actually, when you're working on one section, and we just finished the petals, and they are so vibrant and they pop so much, that then those centers of the flowers kind of looked like they were going a little bit pale. So we want to go back and go over them and just kind of give them another glaze. That means another layer. So we're going to go in first with that burnt sienna, and then now instead of the cadmium red, I'm going to use that permanent yellow. Any kind of warm yellow you have will work, an Indian yellow, because that cad red is still there. It's underneath there, and because since watercolor is translucent, by going over it with that yellow, it will just help to make that center glow that much more. Now, if you don't have a heat tool, let your painting dry, but otherwise, let's give this a dry, and we'll be back in just a moment. If you don't have a heat tool or don't want to invest in one, that's fine. You can use a hairdryer. Just make sure you have it on the lowest setting. It doesn't need to be anything strong at all. And I would keep it on the low heat and keep it a bit of a distance from your work, because you don't want to blow your paint, at least not for this, what we're working on now. You'll notice that the flowers are a little bit more pale. With watercolor, there's always a color shift, so don't let that fool you if you thought it was going to be as vibrant as it was when you first put that color down. It always dries just a little bit lighter, so kind of keep that in mind when you're painting. If something looks like it's just too shockingly deep in hue and value, maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll be just fine once it dries. So now I'm trying to mix a green for the stems. I started off with that yellow green and I mixed in a little bit of burnt sienna, but I'm not satisfied with that. So I'm going to go in ultimately and mix in some of the phthalo green, which is a PG7. If you have a phthalo green or something that's a PG7, that would be fabulous to mix in. You just want to kind of get this green to be a little bit more earthy. They're not really a bright green flower. The leaves are pretty bright, but we want these stems to be just a little bit darker, more toward the olive range. And you'll notice when I'm pulling the stems down, I start at the top from the base of the flower, and then I just pick my paintbrush up over the flower that it's going to be behind, and just kind of continue as if I was still painting, but my brush isn't touching the paper, and then I just pick that line up underneath it. So I'll show you here on this one. So I'm starting underneath the flower, and I go to that one and just kind of work my way down, picking up wherever there is already something there, and then continuing the stem when I have white space. I hope that makes sense. That's a good way to get your stems so that your flowers can be in front of one another, and you can always be sure that that you won't be painting a stem right over another flower. Because since watercolor is transparent, we don't really want to do that. We want to keep those stems behind the flowers that are in front of it. And then these leaves are very simple. We're just going to do them pretty much like we did the petals. And you'll notice I'm using my number 4 brush this time, by the way. I'm keeping them just really very subtle and kind of a suggestion, trying to get them to go in different directions. So practice painting your stroke. You can do this on a piece of scratch paper, kind of trying to go see what it would be like if one was coming straight down at you, like this one right here. Just go up a little bit and then pull it straight down. Try and get one to go off to the side. You're going to make it very thin, and just try not to make them all symmetrical and unique. Try and keep them unique, rather. Just try and keep a little bit of variance in your work, and that way they'll tend to look a little bit more natural, because nature is not always symmetrical. Now let's go back into that burnt sienna, and this time I want to mix it with some of that quinacridone violet. So any kind of burnt sienna mixed with any of the purples or reds that you used, and just kind of make it a really reddish brown or a purplish brown, just something that's really a little bit more rich than that burnt sienna on its own. And what we want to do this time is to go ahead and paint the little fronds that are inside the cones on the coneflower. Now we're not painting all of them. I only want you to paint the ones that are kind of in the area of the brown. Now these are going to be much bigger than they would be had we tried to go for something more photorealistic. So we're not looking for anything real accurate here. I even don't know what these things are called. I am not a botanical illustrator. I'm not a botanist. I know that flowers are pretty and I like to paint them, and that's pretty much where my knowledge stops. I remember learning about pistils and stamens from 9th grade biology, but after that, I'm done. All I know is that it either smells good or it smells bad, and I either want it in my yard or I don't. So I'm not the one to refer to for appropriate parts of plants. So forgive me for that. But what I will tell you is that these little frondy-like things, we're just going to do a few of them. We don't need to paint them all, because otherwise it might look like that center is kind of a porcupine. We just want to paint just a few of them, just to suggest that they're there. Because in reality, in our minds, we know that they're there. We know what these flowers look like. They're very common. We just don't need to depict every single thing. And that is one way to keep things very loose, very easy, very free. And that is the way that we want to do this painting, is to keep it in that loose, watercolory, free, free-flowing style. So we're going to just finish up these fronds. And again, this is with a number 4. And this particular part, make sure that your centers of your flowers are nice and dry, because this time we don't want them to mix. This time we're doing wet on dry. And I'm just going to go real tiny back in here on this one underneath and just kind of make sure that one's got some of those little lines on it. And then, you know what? I think it is time to do some splatter. We're going to make a nice big juicy pile of the reds that we used. And your brush has to be a little bit wet for this. And you can splatter by shaking your brush like that. You can tap your brush. You can tap it on another brush. You can throw it like a dagger kind of, and then stop it just before it hits the paper. I don't mean literally throw it. I just mean make that motion with your wrist like you're throwing a dagger or a dart. And then just kind of make your wrist stop right before it hits the paper. So you're just like flicking it in that with that part of your brush, the bristles, pointing toward the paper, if that makes sense. I prefer this method most often. I usually just hold the brush in one hand and tap with the other hand. You can always practice your splatters, because it is kind of an art, really. In and of itself, it's kind of an art form, because you want to make sure you have enough paint. You want to make sure you don't have too much water. And something else that's really important to remember is that different brushes are going to give you different splatter patterns. I am horrible about covering up my area. I always forget to do that. So if you're working near a computer or something that you don't want to get splatter on it, be sure you cover up the area with some newspapers or paper towels or what have you, because this can get literally out of hand. The colors that I used to splatter on were all of the reds that we used, both purples and that permanent yellow. I also used whatever green mix I had there on my palette. I didn't use any of the burnt sienna. I didn't think that would look good. You can if you want to. I just tend to splatter with whatever bright, vibrant colors I've painted with. You can even splatter with just plain water. And that is most effective when the paints are still wet, because you can create a cauliflower bloom that really gives you a neat starburst effect. So when this is done, you'll see up close here, I will show you how mine came out. And I hope that you guys had fun doing this, and I hope you really enjoyed learning how to splatter and how to make petals and leaves with your brush. Let's go ahead and finish drying this up, and then we'll look at the final product. Normally when I remove the tape, I'm still holding the heat tool on it, but I'm catching this right away and it was still pretty warm. This is washi tape. It's a very low tack tape. Any kind of tape that you use will be fine, but you may have to run that heat tool just ahead of where you're pulling in order to keep the paper from getting damaged. You'll notice that I pull away at that 90-degree angle in order to create a nice, easy removal of that tape. Here you go, guys. Here is our painting of Coneflowers. Don't forget to sign and date your work. It's very important to sign it on the front. Be proud of what you've done. You did that. You made something. And you know, when you look ahead, when you look back, rather, 2 weeks from now, you'll be so proud of yourself because you did that. Thanks so much for hanging out with me, guys. I hope you had a good time. We'll talk to you next time on Art on the Creek. Have fun painting. Bye now.